Embedding the Family in the Irish Constitution. Dr. Thomas Mohr. School of Law, University College Dublin. Introduction. The Irish Constitution of 1937 devotes a substantial part of its provisions on fundamental rights to the position of the family in Irish society. Article 41 of the 1937 Constitution has proved to be one of the most controversial provisions in that document. Some commentators accuse it of reflecting Catholic social values, providing unwelcome stereotypes on the position of women in Irish society, and promoting the marital family at the expense of an increasing number of non-marital families. Others argue that these provisions are typical of constitutions of the 1920s and 1930s from all parts of Europe and, consequently, should not necessarily be seen as the product of Catholic social teachings. No equivalent to Article 41 is found in the earlier Irish Free State Constitution of 1922. There were many proposals to enshrine similar provisions in the 1922 Constitution, but all were finally rejected. Although the drafters of the 1922 Constitution had broadly similar attitudes towards the place of the family in Irish society as their counterparts in 1937, they concluded that these were not appropriate matters to be enshrined in a national constitution. The contents of Article 41 have been the subject of frequent debate and analysis. Yet the decision as to whether or not the position of the family was a suitable matter to enshrine in the text of a constitution has received less attention. The absence of any provisions concerning the family in the 1922 Constitution proved to be a major source of criticism for an already controversial document. Yet the provisions on the family that were finally enshrined in its successor have, in turn, proved to be among the most contested provisions of the 1937 Constitution. This chapter will examine the reasons behind the contrasting decisions on whether or not to enshrine the family in a national constitution made in 1922 and 1937. It will also attempt to explain how these contrasting positions reflect wider differences of opinion as to the nature and purpose of a national constitution that distinguished the Irish Constitution of 1937 from its predecessor, the 1922 Constitution of the Irish Free State. Differences in drafting the 1922 and 1937 constitutions. The shared values of the drafters of Irish constitutions of 1922 and 1937 far outweigh any differences between them. Most of the drafters of both documents were devout Catholics. Both constitutions were drafted by men of strong nationalist principles who wished to advance the sovereignty of the Irish state as much as possible. Both constitutions reflected hopes that the territory of Northern Ireland would one day form part of the self-governing Irish state. The drafters of both documents made full use of existing constitutions from Europe and beyond in completing their work. This was a sensible approach as it ensured that the Irish state gained the benefit of experience from working constitutional models. In addition, it is worth emphasizing that many of the provisions of the 1922 Constitution, mostly dealing with the functioning of the Oireachtas, executive, courts and important state offices, were retained by its successor. One commentator has noted the framework of the Constitution of 1937 is basically that of the 1922 Constitution, with additions and subtractions. John Kelly wrote in similar terms when he concluded the Basic Law of 1937 can be fairly presented as a stabilizing and reforming continuation of that of 1922, indeed it would be misleading to present it in any other way. There was no need to start from a tabula rasa in 1937, and there was certainly no desire to jettison the many successful and desirable attributes of the Free State Constitution in the 1930s. The first major difference that even the most cursory reader will notice between the Irish constitutions of 1922 and 1937 concerns the issue of sovereignty. In 1922, the Irish Provisional Government was required to give the British government a confidential preview of their draft constitution before it was made public. This ensured that the final version of the 1922 Constitution had to incorporate a substantial number of provisions reflecting the settlement reached in the 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty. By contrast, the 1937 Constitution was drafted after a series of constitutional amendments had largely dismantled the treaty settlement. The enhanced autonomy enjoyed by the Dominions after the enactment of the 1931 Statute of Westminster facilitated this process and ensured that the United Kingdom played no role in the drafting of the 1937 Constitution. Consequently, the drafters of the 1937 Constitution did not have to look over their shoulders to London while undertaking their task. The next major difference between the Irish constitutions of 1922 and 1937 concerns the place of religion in the two texts. There are no references to God in the substantive provisions of the 1922 Constitution, and references to religion only appear in provisions designed to maintain freedom of religious worship. By contrast, references to God, Jesus Christ, the Holy Trinity, and other aspects of Christian belief appear throughout the text of the 1937 Constitution. The Church played a relatively passive role in the drafting of the 1922 Constitution, and was only consulted on the text of Article 8, which concerned the free profession and practice of religion. By contrast, the future Archbishop of Dublin, John Charles McQuaid, and Special Committee of Jesuits, including de Valera's friend Edward Cahill S.J., played important roles in the drafting of the 1937 Constitution. In addition, draft provisions were sent to Rome in order to obtain papal approval, or at least to avoid papal disapproval, in 1937. As events transpired, Rome did not approve or disapprove of the 1937 text, but its commitment to remain silent on the issue was sufficient reassurance for the Irish government. This chapter is concerned with a third noticeable difference between the two Irish constitutions. The 1922 Constitution focuses on establishing the machinery of governance such as an executive, a national parliament, a system of courts, and details a number of fundamental rights. There are relatively few statements in the 1922 text that might be considered directive principles, meaning that they had no immediate or obvious legal impact on state institutions or the rights of citizens, but were primarily intended as matters of guidance along a desired path of development for the state. This was no accident, but the result of a deliberate policy to exclude directive principles in 1922. The 1937 Constitution also provides sustained attention to the machinery of government in provisions that are largely similar to those of the 1922 Constitution. Yet the 1937 Constitution also contains far more directive principles than its predecessor that can be seen as reflecting philosophical and social values commonly associated with the Catholic Church. For example, Article 44.1.1 declares, the state acknowledges that the homage of public worship is due to Almighty God. It shall hold his name in reverence, and shall respect and honor religion. Article 44.1.2 of the original text provided the state recognizes the special position of the Holy Catholic Apostolic and Roman Church as the guardian of the faith professed by the great majority of the citizens, and also recognized the existence of other named religions. These can be termed directive principles as they had no obvious and immediate impact on the governance of the state or the rights of its citizens, but were intended as guidance along a desired path of development for the future state. Article 45 of the Constitution contains provisions that are officially known as directive principles of social policy. These are expressly intended to provide guidance to the Oireachtas, and their provisions are not cognizable by the courts. Article 45 contains such directive principles as the commitment to support the infirm, the widow, the orphan, and the aged, that the tender age of children shall not be abused, and that citizens shall not be forced by economic necessity to enter avocations unsuited to their sex, age or strength, and the establishment on the land in economic security as many families as in the circumstances shall be practicable. The 1937 Constitution also contains numerous references to the natural law, a concept that enjoyed particular popularity with Catholic theologians and philosophers in the early 20th century. Although these references may also have been intended as directive principles, they would later have a direct impact on the development of Irish law in the form of recognition of unenumerated rights. Directive principles were consciously omitted from the 1922 Constitution of the Irish Free State in contrast to the stance adopted in 1937. The Catholic Truth Society and Professor Alfred Orhilly of University College Cork, a member of the 1922 Drafting Committee, lobbied for the inclusion of provisions concerning the family and religious education containing directive principles but without success. The 1922 Constitution Committee also examined numerous foreign constitutions containing detailed provisions on the family yet declined to emulate their example. Finally, amendments were proposed in the Constituent Assembly that enacted the 1922 Constitution that attempted to enshrine provisions on the family reflecting a similar spirit to those finally included in the 1937 Constitution. Yet the provisional government rejected all draft provisions concerning the position of the family in 1922. The contrasting approach towards the position of the family within the text of the Constitution was not the result of differing social or religious values between 1922 and 1937. As mentioned earlier, most of the drafters of the 1922 Constitution and members of the provisional government shared the values and attitudes towards the family of their successors in 1937. These contrasting approaches could be attributed to the different circumstances in which the two constitutions were drafted, an active British government and a passive Catholic Church in 1922, with a passive British government and an active Catholic Church in 1937. Yet the fundamental reason for the different approach was differing attitudes as to what a national constitution should be and what purpose it should serve. Those responsible for the drafting and enacting of the 1922 Constitution wanted a short and simple document that focused primarily on establishing the mechanics of governance for the infant state. In these circumstances, they were determined to keep directive principles to an absolute minimum in the text. This resulted in a policy of rejecting draft provisions containing directive principles concerning the role and position of the family, notwithstanding broad agreement with their contents. This chapter will examine all of the provisions concerning the family in the 1937 Constitution and analyze whether or not they were consistent with the values of those responsible for the enactment of the 1922 Constitution. It will also examine the proposals to embed the family in the 1922 Constitution and explain why all of these efforts were unsuccessful, notwithstanding broad agreement with their contents. Finally, it will explain why the drafters of the 1922 Constitution insisted on producing as short and simple a document as possible that consciously kept directive principles, including declarations on the position of the family in Irish society, out of the text. The position of the family. De Valera considered the very word home to have sacred qualities. Recognition of the role of the family in society and as a buttress to the state was considered fundamental by the drafters of the 1937 Constitution, an approach supported by numerous papal encyclicals. For example, according to Leo Xii's Sapientiae Christiani, 1890, the family may be regarded as the cradle of civil society, and it is in great measure within the circle of family life that the destiny of the state is fostered. Other papal encyclicals also provided important sources of inspiration, in particular Leo Xii's Rerum Novarum of 1891 and Pius X's Casti Connubii of 1930. A number of existing constitutions from Catholic countries also proved influential, for example, the 1933 Constitution of Portugal. The institution of the family was seen as being older than all other human communities, including sovereign states and their institutions. It was seen as an institution supported and protected by eternal and unchanging natural law. This point was emphasized by the clerical advisors to the government on the drafting of the 1937 Constitution, including the future Archbishop of Dublin, John Charles McQuaid, and a special committee of Jesuits. It is no coincidence that the institution of the family inspired McQuaid to write a lengthy philosophical disquisition on the nature and contents of natural law that drew on the works of St. Thomas Aquinas and various papal encyclicals. McQuaid wrote that the family was an institution of nature, a moral institution in the sense that, on the analogy of the human person, it possesses rights and is bound by obligations. All these considerations ensured that the family was seen as entitled to protection from interference from the state in all but the most extreme circumstances. This area of protection intersected with many other fundamental rights, including those of religion, property, and education. Many of the contributors to the drafting of the 1937 Constitution also believed that the institution of the family could also be utilized as a means of improving the governance of the state. For example, proposals were made during the drafting of the 1937 Constitution that an extra vote be given in Dale elections to heads of families intended to emphasize a family outlook in political affairs as compared to an irresponsible individualistic outlook. It was also proposed that the 1937 Constitution should follow the example of the 1933 Constitution of Portugal and establish rural parochial committees that would be elected by heads of families. This was advocated by Edward Cahill, who argued that such committees, being founded on the natural basis of the family and the parish, would be saved from the corruption and the jobbery, which apparently prevailed in the previous rural councils. The Irish government rejected all these proposals. Instead, the 1937 Constitution focused on enshrining principles that reflected the right of the family to protection from state interference in all but the most extreme circumstances. The opening provisions of Article 41 of the 1937 Constitution are very similar to a number of drafts offered by the Jesuit Advisory Committee. They begin by recognizing the importance of the family to society and the state. They also recognize the position of the family under natural law. 41.1.1 The state recognizes the family as the natural primary and fundamental unit group of society, and as a moral institution possessing inalienable and imprescriptible rights, antecedent and superior to all positive law. 41.1.2 The state, therefore, guarantees to protect the family in its constitution and authority, as the necessary basis of social order and as indispensable to the welfare of the nation and the state.
It is unlikely that the Irish government in power in 1922 would have disagreed with any of the principles outlined in Article 41 of the 1937 Constitution. Of course, Rerum Novarum and other relevant papal encyclicals were also available in this period. Kevin O'Higgins, Minister for External Affairs and Minister for Justice, associated the family with the natural law at the Imperial Conference of 1926 when he joined the South African delegation in opposing a change to the nationality law common to all members of the Commonwealth. The current state of the law provided that a woman who married an alien lost her nationality irrespective of whether or not she was entitled to receive the nationality of her husband. O'Higgins objected to the proposal that women should have the right to choose whether or not to keep their original nationality on marriage to an alien. He argued that tolerating difficult nationalities would be to create a national frontier within the family. He used natural law principles and evoked the works of St. Thomas Aquinas to justify this stance. The common values between those responsible for the creation of the two Irish constitutions were also evident during the 1937 parliamentary debates on the provisions concerning the family that appeared in de Valera's draft constitution. Members of Fine Gael, which included most of the Cumann no Engate administration that had held power between 1922 and 1932, did not disagree with the concept of the family as the natural primary and fundamental unit group of society. Instead, they attacked the vagueness of these provisions and their suitability for inclusion in a national constitution.
The position of women. 41.2.1 In particular, the state recognizes that by her life within the home, woman gives to the state a support without which the common good cannot be achieved. 41.2.2 The state shall, therefore, endeavor to ensure that mothers shall not be obliged by economic necessity to engage in labor to the neglect of their duties in the home. Although many European constitutions in the 1920s and 1930s contained provisions for the protection of maternity, Article 41 of the 1937 Irish Constitution recognized the place of woman instead of mothers in the home. De Valera refused to replace the word woman in Article 41.2.1 degree notwithstanding arguments that it would make the article far more acceptable. The papal encyclical Rerum Novarum provided a woman is by nature fitted for homework, and it is that which is best adapted at once to preserve her modesty and to promote the good bring-up of children and the well-being of the family.
Women's organizations made unfavorable comparisons between these provisions of Eamon de Valera's draft constitution and those of the 1922 constitution. The National University Women Graduates Association passed a resolution that presented the 1922 Constitution as a document reflecting principles of equal rights and opportunities. This was contrasted to the draft Constitution of 1937, which was presented as a sinister and retrogressive measure. The 1922 Constitution has long served as a useful foil to be used against its successor with respect to its treatment of women. Many of these eulogies of the 1922 Constitution were based on what it did not say rather than on what it did. The 1922 Constitution did not attempt to stereotype the place of women in society. It did not speak of life or duties within the home. It did not speak of preventing people from entering avocations unsuited to their sex, age, and strength. Nevertheless, the attitudes of the administrations in power in 1922 and 1937 were almost identical on these points. The assumption that a woman's place was in the home surfaced again and again in legislation passed by the government that had overseen the enactment of the 1922 Constitution. This is evident in legislation permitting the exclusion of women from certain types of employment, the maintenance of the marriage bar in the civil service, and the gradual removal of women from juries. The undesirability of women being employed in certain professions, for example as customs officers, was raised on many occasions in the Oiriators. Kevin O'Higgins, as Minister for Justice, even excluded women stenographers from the Circuit Court and from the Central Criminal Court on the basis that these courts often dealt with matters which one would not like to discuss with the feminine members of one's own family. O'Higgins' position on the place of women in Irish society was almost identical to that enshrined in Article 41.2, as illustrated when he told the Dáil, "It is the normal and natural function of women to have children." It still is the normal and natural function of women to have charge of households.
The position of marriage. 41.3.1 degree The state pledges itself to guard with special care the institution of marriage, on which the family is founded, and to protect it against attack. 41.3.2 degree No law shall be enacted providing for the grant of a dissolution of marriage. 41.3.3 degree No person whose marriage has been dissolved under the civil law of any other state but is a subsisting valid marriage under the law for the time being in force within the jurisdiction of the government and parliament established by this constitution shall be capable of contracting a valid marriage within that jurisdiction during the lifetime of the other party to the marriage so dissolved. These provisions concerning the family go beyond the status of being directive principles. In particular, the prohibition on the enactment of laws permitting the dissolution of marriage had more obvious practical implications than other provisions of Article 41. Yet these provisions also attracted considerable controversy during their lifetime. The absolute prohibition on divorce was finally removed in 1995 and was replaced by a new Article 41.3.2 degree that contains details of the conditions required for granting a dissolution of marriage that are more suitable as legislative provisions than being embedded in the text of a national constitution. The provisions of the revised Article 41.3.2 degree erect formidable obstacles to those seeking dissolution of marriage and reflect a continuing sense of hostility to the institution of divorce. Early drafts of the 1937 Constitution listed grounds for annulment and provided for the dissolution of the marriages of unbaptized persons under certain circumstances. These detailed provisions threatened considerable controversy, and the position was simplified by forbidding any law that would provide for dissolution of marriage irrespective of the religious status of the married partners. There were also some additional provisions concerning marriage that were considered during the drafting process. The Jesuit Advisory Committee recommended that the law on betrothal and marriage for Catholics be made identical with canon law. No such provision was included in the final text of the 1937 Constitution, meaning that marriages recognized by the state and those recognized by the Catholic Church would never be entirely identical. The early drafts also included provisions intended to repress the practice of contraception. Contraception and the advocacy of the practice of contraception are prohibited, and the possession, use, sale and distribution of contraceptives shall be punishable by law. The most likely reason for the removal of this provision from the draft version of the 1937 Constitution was that the prohibition of publications advocating the use of contraceptives and an actual ban on the sale and importation of contraceptives were already enshrined in recently enacted legislation. Attitudes towards marriage were broadly similar in 1922. Although the Irish courts had never been empowered to grant divorce a vinculo matrimoniae, it was still possible, before 1922, for the wealthy to obtain a full divorce by means of a private bill passed through Parliament. This narrow outlet was closed after 1922 when the Oireachtas refused to enact any such measure. A dispute between the two houses of the Oireachtas erupted in 1925 when W. T. Cosgrave and Kevin O'Higgins proposed changing the standing orders in order to prevent private bills requesting divorce from even being placed before the Irish legislature. Many senators, including the Cathaoirleach, Lord Glenavy, argued that citizens could not be prevented by parliamentary standing orders from exercising their legal right at common law to petition the Oireachtas for a private bill, even if, in practice, there was little chance of that private bill being accepted. Even the theoretical possibility of the Oireachtas granting a divorce proved unacceptable to the Cosgrave administration, and a proposed procedural compromise only worsened the dispute. Although the Cosgrave government never introduced legal or administrative measures that formally closed the theoretical possibility of gaining a divorce a vinculo matrimoniae by means of a private bill, no such bill was ever passed in the lifetime of the Irish Free State. There can be no doubt that the attitude of the Cosgrave administration to the institution of divorce was virtually identical with the drafters of the 1937 Constitution. In 1925, Cosgrave told the Dáil, "I have no doubt but that I am right in saying that the majority of people of this country regard the bond of marriage as a sacramental bond which is incapable of being dissolved. I personally hold this view. I consider that the whole fabric of our social organization is based upon the sanctity of the marriage bond, and that anything that tends to weaken the binding efficacy of that bond to that extent strikes at the root of our social life." This common attitude towards divorce was also apparent when James Dillon, a leading Fine Gael politician, declared during the debates on the 1937 Constitution that protecting the sanctity of marriage is a purpose that will command the assent of every deputy in this House. Kevin O'Higgins' assertion in 1926 that allowing a husband and wife to have different nationalities was inconsistent with the concept of Christian marriage went far beyond anything asserted in the 1937 Constitution. A preparatory draft of Article 41 of the 1937 Constitution would have added the following words: "Propaganda directed against the sanctity of marriage and family life are prohibited." This provision appears to have been directed against material providing information or advice on contraception and abortion. These provisions were removed from the final text of Article 41, but, once again, it is possible to provide examples of similar values being held by those responsible for bringing the 1922 Constitution into existence. In 1922, Kevin O'Higgins rejected a draft provision proposed by the Labour Party that would have provided the secrecy of correspondence and communication by post, telegraph, telephone, or other common means is guaranteed and is inviolable. O'Higgins rejected this proposal on the grounds that it would prevent the government from limiting correspondence aimed at facilitating illegal gambling and indecent and immoral circulars and advertisements. According to O'Higgins, the latter included advertisements encouraging the limitation of childbirth and advertising all kinds of immorality, and all kinds of indecent devices are sent through the post. It is also worth noting that the limitation of fundamental rights as being subject to public order and morality that appears in relation to many provisions of the 1937 Constitution was originally inserted in the 1922 Constitution in connection with matters concerning the institution of marriage. The Catholic bishops were concerned that the original provisions in the draft 1922 Constitution on the free profession and practice of religion would permit Mormonism with plurality of wives. The insertion of public order and morality was intended to prevent such deviations from the accepted form of marital relations. The role of the family in education. The drafters of the 1937 Constitution were convinced that the position of the family intersected with fundamental rights outside the confines of the institution of marriage and the autonomy of the family. For example, the institution of the family was frequently raised in connection with property rights. Consequently, the Jesuit Advisory Committee advocated the inclusion of special provisions on rural families and their property rights. Other important areas influenced by the institution of the family included the provisions on education that were finally enshrined in Article 42 of the 1937 Constitution. Once again, this position was supported by papal encyclicals, in particular Pius Xi's Divini Ilius Magistri, 1929. The Jesuit Committee wrote, "The primary responsibility and control of the education of the young belong inalienably to the parents and the Church." An early official draft of the Constitution included a duty on parents to maintain discipline in the home. The final text of Article 42 omitted any reference to the Church or maintaining discipline, but did place the family at the heart of rights to education. 42.1 The state acknowledges that the primary and natural educator of the child is the family and guarantees to respect the inalienable right and duty of parents to provide, according to their means, for the religious and moral, intellectual, physical and social education of their children. 42.2 Parents shall be free to provide this education in their homes or in private schools or in schools recognized or established by the state. 42.3.1 The state shall not oblige parents in violation of their conscience and lawful preference to send their children to schools established by the state, or to any particular type of school designated by the state. 42.3.2 The state shall, however, as guardian of the common good, require in view of actual conditions that the children receive a certain minimum education, moral, intellectual and social. 42.4 The state shall provide for free primary education and shall endeavor to supplement and give reasonable aid to private and corporate educational initiative, and, when the public good requires it, provide other educational facilities or institutions with due regard, however, for the rights of parents, especially in the matter of religious and moral formation. 42.5 In exceptional cases, where the parents for physical or moral reasons fail in their duty towards their children, the state as guardian of the common good, by appropriate means shall endeavor to supply the place of the parents, but always with due regard for the natural and imprescriptible rights of the child. The provisions on the right to education in the 1922 Constitution were far less elaborate. Article 10 of the 1922 Constitution provided all citizens of the Irish Free State, Sourstad Éireann, have the right to free elementary education, which was later incorporated into the wider provisions of Article 42 of its successor. An initiative to place a more detailed provision on education into the 1922 Constitution was sponsored by the Labour Party. The right of the children to food, clothing, shelter and education, sufficient for their proper physical welfare and training as citizens of Sourstad Éireann is guaranteed. It is the duty of all citizens to ensure that their children and wards receive adequate education. To this end provision shall be made by the state for the free education of the young up to an age to be prescribed by law. School attendance shall be compulsory. Provision shall be made by the state, so that secondary and higher educational institutions shall be readily accessible in the case of persons with small means. All schools and educational establishments, public and private, shall be controlled by the state, within limits to be determined by law. All schools and educational establishments shall aim at inculcating moral character, religious tolerance, and personal and vocational efficiency, and the teaching given therein shall be imbued with the spirit of Irish nationality and international goodwill. The duties of citizenship shall be a subject of instruction in all schools in order to fit the pupil for his responsibilities as a citizen. This was seen as incompatible with the provisional government's aim of producing as short and simple a constitution as possible. Hugh Kennedy wrote that it contained a large amount of controversial matter that was more properly the subject of ordinary legislation. The opposition in the Constituent Assembly had by this time become familiar with the provisional government's opposition to enshrining directive principles in the draft constitution. Consequently, it agreed to consolidate these detailed provisions into a single sentence. Provision shall be made by Sorstad Éireann for the free education of the young, and for their compulsory attendance at school up to such an age, and to such a stage of instruction as shall be prescribed by law. This provision was also rejected on grounds that illustrate that the main difference between the drafters of the 1922 and 1937 constitutions was their drafting approach. Professor Owen McNeill, Minister for Education, made clear his view. My position is that the right of education, in the first place and fundamentally, belongs to the parents of the children, or those who are in loco parentis, so long as the children are properly under that parental control, in the first place, and fundamentally, that is the higher right, a more fundamental right, than any right possessed by the state. Although McNeill was convinced that the state should intervene in cases of dereliction of duty, he was convinced that it was wrong to compel every child to make use of provisions for education provided by the state and emphasized the right of parents to educate their children at home.
George O'Brien, a barrister who acted as an external advisor on the drafting of the 1922 Constitution, argued that if rights to education were included in the text, the fact should be emphasized that the state's duty to provide education for children only arises on the failure or incapacity of the parents doing so. The primary duty of the state in the matter is one of supervision. Darrell Figgis and other members of the Constitution Committee declined to accept this recommendation during the drafting of the 1922 Constitution. This, we believe, is a matter rather for legislation. Details of such a controversial kind must be avoided in a constitution. Once again, it is apparent that the values of most of the drafters and sponsors of the 1922 Constitution were similar to those of the 1937 Constitution. The main difference concerned their approach to drafting and their perceptions of the primary purpose of a national constitution. The 1922 Constitution as the mechanics of governance. The drafters of the 1922 Constitution took a much more restrained approach to creating constitutional provisions than their counterparts in 1937. The provisional government's desire for a constitution that was as short and simple as possible was stressed at the very first meeting on the 24th of January 1922. Michael Collins, the official chairman, instructed the rest of the committee. The constitution should be as simple as possible and should be got out as quickly as possible. In the simple form suggested, it would serve as our permanent constitution, which need never be altered, but could be added up to, as the final stages of complete freedom were gained. One of the earliest drafts produced in 1922 contained a mere 10 articles. Although later drafts were much longer, it became clear from the outset that the emphasis was on producing a constitution that would provide, in the words of Irish ministers, the basic mechanics of government for the new state. Later drafts did include provisions on matters such as free expression, free assembly, freedom of religion and a right to free elementary education, but these were drafted in concise and general terms. This approach to producing a simple and concise document was bolstered by the contributions of two external advisors, George O'Brien and T.M. Healy, who were asked to give their views on the draft constitution. O'Brien advised the government. A sound maxim is that a constitution should be as short as possible and it should fetter as little as possible the freedom of the legislative body which it creates. For this reason, I have suggested the omission of various articles and provisions which appear to me to deal with matters which could be more satisfactorily dealt with by ordinary legislation. Healy offered similar advice in more colourful terms. What is wanted is dry unassailable technique, which can't be quarrelled with by either Carson or de Valera, but which by its generality imparts and attracts the utmost sovereignty without saying so. This can be done more effectively by vagueness than by assertion. No definition but looseness is what is needed, provided the looseness favours Irish construction, or interpretation hereafter. We need vagueness instead of definition, but above all not the definition of Ter Enog or Noah's Ark. Leave no loopholes for attack or cramp. Banish sentiment. Imitate the style of a bill of costs. Once a draft was finally selected as the basis for a future constitution, Michael Collins, W.T. Cosgrave, George Gavin Duffy and Owen McNeill wrote assessments that concluded that the draft was too long and required cutting down. McNeill also made clear his disapproval of declaratory statements such as the statements of national and social principles set out in one of the unsuccessful drafts proposed as the basis of the future constitution. He concluded, "Some actual constitutions contain such declaratory statements, and I doubt if they amount to much as constitutional provisions." George Gavin Duffy was the most vehement member of the government in insisting that the draft constitution needed cutting down in length. He believed that the text was too difficult for the man on the street who would have to vote on it. Duffy also advocated the removal of directive principles that were contained in the opening provisions and elsewhere in the chosen draft. Darrell Figgis took umbrage at criticism as to the length of the draft constitution and produced figures to show that it was relatively succinct when compared to the constitutions of existing states. He pointed out that the current draft could be reproduced on a single page of newspaper. Nevertheless, in April 1922 the provisional government began the process of paring down its provisions, although the cuts were not as radical as had been proposed by Duffy. Additional cuts were made at the insistence of the British government in June 1922. These included rare examples of provisions that might be considered directive principles that had survived the drafting process in 1922. These provisions extended national sovereignty to the nation's wealth, natural resources, and other material possessions in addition to its human population. They were taken from the works of Patrick Pius and provided useful links to the 1916 Rising and the 1919 Democratic Program. These provisions were considered undesirable by several of the provisional government's own advisers and also met with hostility from the British government once they saw the draft constitution. Consequently, these opening provisions were removed despite their obvious propaganda value.
The desire for a short and simple constitution in 1922. Why was there such a determination among the drafters to produce a short constitution that kept directive principles to a minimum in 1922? There are a number of possible explanations. One is that the Irish Free State was intended to be a British Dominion under the 1921 treaty, and that the constitutions of the dominions focused on the mechanics of government and contained few provisions that could be described as directive principles. However, this argument cannot be considered conclusive, as Collins and Griffith had made it clear to the Constitution Committee that it was not to be considered as being bound by Dominion precedents when drafting the text.
A more convincing consideration that assists in explaining the different approaches to drafting a constitution in 1922 and 1937 concerns differences in the dominant personalities behind the two Irish constitutions. Although de Valera's role in creating the 1937 Constitution has been exaggerated in the past, it cannot be denied that he did play a major role in the drafting process. De Valera certainly favored the insertion of directive principles in a constitution in order to inspire and elicit loyalty from the Irish people. This approach was also encouraged by the submissions made by his clerical advisers, John Charles McQuaid, Edward Cahill, and the Special Jesuit Advisory Committee. Although some scholars argue that the Free State Constitution was intended to be Michael Collins' constitution, this never became reality. Collins never had the time or luxury for involvement in the drafting process, to the extent enjoyed by de Valera in 1937. Although Collins was appointed chairman of the committee that drafted the 1922 Constitution, he had many other responsibilities that ensured that he only attended 2 meetings during the initial drafting process. Yet he was involved in later revisions of the draft constitution and led the Irish delegation along with Arthur Griffith in negotiating key amendments with the British government. Most important of all, Collins did establish the important principle at the very first meeting of the 1922 Constitution Committee that the document they produced should be as simple as possible. Collins also oversaw the drafting of a brief outline of a constitution that dealt entirely with matters of governance and contained little material that could be described as directive principles. Collins' practical approach that insisted on a concise and functional text was maintained after his death by his successors in the provisional government.
The only significant voice of dissent on this point came from Professor Alfred O'Rahilly, a maverick member of the 1922 Constitution Committee, who was convinced that it was proper if not essential to include directive principles on important social and spiritual matters in a national constitution. According to O'Rahilly, the Constitution Committee was amenable to the inclusion of basic social principles in the Constitution, but there was a decided difference as to what principles should be included. Failure to agree at this early stage is likely to have contributed to the emergence of a document that contained a minimum of directive principles. O'Rahilly considered the text finally selected and amended by the provisional government was a meagre document because it avoided such declarations. He complained to government officials in 1922, "I may, for instance, point out that the draft does not mention God, the family, religious education, that is, contains no democratic social or labor ideals." He believed that a constitution should serve as a source of inspiration and guidance for its citizens and considered directive principles to be the most characteristic aspect of a national constitution. These attitudes were shared in common with de Valera and other drafters of the 1937 Constitution. Consequently, O'Rahilly's vision of the purpose and nature of a constitution deserve examination as a link between the drafting of the 1922 and 1937 constitutions. His views on the position of the family in a national constitution also merit particular attention.